She was invisible until the night she fell. What happens when the woman everyone overlooks becomes the one person who changes everything? Grace Whitmore worked quietly, loved quietly, lived quietly. After a painful divorce and a life that never quite turned out the way she'd hoped, she became the kind of person the world forgets until a late night at the office. One small accident, and one man changed the course of her life forever. He was her boss, a man known for being cold, distant, untouchable, and yet, in her quiet pain, he saw something. But what if being seen meant becoming the target of whispers, betrayal, and old wounds reopening? What would you do if someone finally noticed you, but the world wasn't ready for it? This is not a fairy tale. It's a story about being broken and brave, about being ordinary, and finally choosing yourself. If this story touches you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, leave a comment, or simply sit with us through the next few minutes, because sometimes healing begins with being heard. Now, let us take you back to the night. Grace fell. She arrived early, stayed late, and yet no one knew her name until the night she fell. There was a quiet rhythm to the way Grace Whitmore moved through the world. Each morning, long before the sun stretched itself across the sleepy rooftops of Charleston, she stepped into the lobby of Langston & Co. with a stainless steel thermos in one hand and a canvas tote tucked under her arm. She wore neutral tones, always beige, gray, or soft navy, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple twist, like a punctuation mark that never tried to say too much. She didn't linger in break rooms or laugh too loudly at office banter. Her desk sat 3 rows from the corner window, and while others came and went with chatter and perfume and clacking heels, Grace simply worked, efficiently, silently, invisibly. At 34, Grace had grown comfortable with her own quiet, or at least, that's what she told herself. Divorced for nearly 4 years. She lived in a modest apartment above an antiques shop in the historic district. No children, no pets, just the ticking of a kitchen clock and the occasional creak of floorboards to keep her company. Her ex-husband, Tom, had once said she had the emotional temperature of a library. He said it with a laugh, but it landed like a verdict. So, she learned to lower her voice and smooth her expressions, to be reliable but unremarkable. In a company filled with ambitious designers, power suits, and bold visionaries, Grace found safety in being the person no one noticed. Until the night she fell. It was late, well past the time most of the building had gone dark. Outside, a cold February rain painted the city in streaks of silver. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Grace stood alone in the third-floor file room, her ankle-length skirt brushing against her calves as she stretched on tiptoes. She was reaching for the final portfolio in a row of binders, an outdated zoning map from the Charleston archives. It wasn't even part of her assigned work, but Mr. Brenner from operations had asked, and Grace never said no to anyone who asked nicely. She spotted the binder, just out of reach on the top shelf, no step stool in sight. She considered leaving it for morning, just for a moment. Then she thought about how often she'd delayed her own needs before, how putting things off had become a habit, a shield, a way to make herself smaller. So, with one deep breath, Grace pulled a nearby swivel chair into place and climbed on, careful, but not careful enough. The second she leaned in just a little too far, the chair rolled from beneath her like a startled animal. Her balance gave way, the world tipped, then a sickening thud. She landed hard on the linoleum floor. The sound echoed, followed by silence, then the sharp sting of pain radiating through her right ankle and hip. She lay still for a moment, winded, the cold of the floor biting through her sweater. When she tried to sit up, a bolt of pain shot from her ankle straight to her spine. Gritting her teeth, she reached for the chair but couldn't pull herself up. Panic prickled the back of her neck. She was alone. Everyone had gone home hours ago. Everyone, she thought, except maybe the cleaning crew. Or, the thought barely finished forming when she heard it. Footsteps, steady, slow, approaching from the hallway. Grace's breath caught. She turned her head toward the doorway, heart pounding in her chest like a drum caught in a storm. And there he was, Garrett Langston, CEO, founder, the name on the building, the man people only spoke about in careful tones, like a legend who might overhear his own story. He stood in the frame of the doorway, tall and composed in a tailored charcoal coat, rain-damp hair clinging just slightly to his temple, his sharp jawline, his watchful gray eyes. He looked like a man sculpted from quiet intensity. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace, still on the floor, flushed crimson. She tried again to sit up, wincing. Garrett stepped forward, his eyes locked onto hers. What happened? His voice wasn't cold. It wasn't even stern. It was low, deliberate, and laced with something she couldn't quite name. She opened her mouth to answer, but found no words. Only heat rising in her cheeks and the ache in her ankle growing stronger. Without waiting, Garrett crossed the room. His movements were efficient, but not hurried. He crouched beside her, not like a CEO, not like a man looking down, but like someone trying to understand. "I think I twisted my ankle," Grace managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond right away. He looked at her face, then at her leg, then back again. And then, in one fluid motion, he reached out a hand. "Let's get you up," he said. His touch was warm, steady. Nothing like the aloof businessman who sat behind glass-walled offices and rarely made eye contact. This wasn't the man they whispered about in elevators. As he helped her to her feet carefully, slowly, his arm around her waist, Grace caught a glimpse of his expression. It wasn't annoyance. It wasn't pity. It was something else entirely. Something softer. Something that looked almost impossibly like concern. She had no idea what to say, but somehow, in the silence that settled between them, Grace felt something shift, not just in her ankle or her pride, but deep inside where her old fears lived. And in that moment, she realized one simple, breathtaking truth. He had seen her. He was known for firing people with a glance, so why was he gently lifting her into his car? Grace had never imagined what it would feel like to be carried. Not since childhood. Not since arms meant safety and not embarrassment. But now, here she was, half leaning, half cradled against Garrett Langston's side, her one good foot barely touching the floor. His arm was strong around her back, the other supporting her legs with surprising ease. There was nothing performative about the way he held her. He didn't speak, he didn't smile, he simply moved with purpose, guiding her through the quiet corridors of Langston & Co., past rows of frosted glass doors and echoing tiles, until they reached the elevator. Grace felt exposed utterly, mortifyingly exposed. "I can walk," she had whispered, cheeks burning, before they even left the file room. "You tried," he replied, without reproach, and that was that. Now, in the soft glow of the elevator's overhead light, she studied the reflection in the mirrored walls. Her skirt was wrinkled from the fall. Her blouse clung damply to her shoulder from the rain outside. Garrett's dark coat, still cold from the weather, framed them both. He looked every bit the part of a man born to lead, sharp-jawed, composed, unreadable, except for his hands. They weren't the hands of a man detached from the world. They were warm, steady, and perhaps most unsettling of all, gentle. Once outside, he helped her into the passenger seat of a sleek, charcoal gray Audi parked directly at the front. No valet, no driver, just him. "Let me take you to urgent care," he said, closing the door softly behind her. She blinked, still uncertain. "You don't have to." "I do." He didn't elaborate, and before she could gather her thoughts, they were on the road. Charleston's cobblestone streets glistening beneath the soft sheen of rain. Storefront lights flickering past like blurred memories. Inside the car, it was quiet, not tense, but still. Grace clutched her tote in her lap, fingers brushing against the spine of the book inside. A worn paperback, the remains of the day. She'd brought it for her lunch break, never expecting the evening to end like this. Garrett glanced sideways at the cover. "You like Ishiguro?" he asked. Her heart skipped. Yes. I reread this one every year." He nodded, eyes back on the road. The butler who keeps everything perfect, even when it's all falling apart. Grace looked down. "It's familiar." That made him glance at her again. Briefly, "I can see that." She shifted uncomfortably. "Most people at the office think it's boring. They're not paying attention." That made her pause. The rest of the ride passed in thoughtful silence. At the clinic, Garrett parked in a reserved space without a second thought and helped her inside, ignoring the curious glances from the night staff. He signed the intake papers before she even saw them. When the nurse handed Grace a clipboard, Garrett gently took it from her. "Use your hands to hold yourself up," he said, motioning to the crutches they had provided. It wasn't condescending. It was instinctive, natural. She watched him as he waited beside her, checking his phone only once, then slipping it back into his coat without typing a single message. Not a CEO, not a man with a building named after him. Just someone present, someone paying attention. The nurse called her name, and Garrett stood. "I'll wait here." 15 minutes later, with her ankle wrapped and instructions printed on a crinkly sheet of paper, she limped back into the lobby to find him still there, still waiting. He stood up the second he saw her. "No fracture," she said quietly, avoiding his eyes. "Just a sprain. That's something," he replied. "I'll take you home." She hesitated. "You've done enough. Really." He tilted his head slightly. "You live off Wentworth, don't you?" Her eyes widened. "How did you—" "You listed it on the emergency contact form. HR shares those with me. I read them." She blinked again, heart catching on the word read. "You read mine." He nodded, casually. "I make a point to know who's working in my company." She didn't know what to say. People said Garrett Langston didn't learn names, that he spoke only when necessary, made decisions like knife cuts, and saw employees as tools, not people. But here he was, saying her name, reading her file, remembering her address. In the car. She sat in silence as the rain picked up, tapping softly against the windshield. Her ankle throbbed, but her chest ached in an entirely different way. When they pulled up outside her apartment, Garrett put the car in park and didn't speak right away. The building was old, with brick stairs and ivy creeping up the side. "You live alone?" he asked quietly. "Yes." He nodded. "Do you have someone who can check on you tomorrow?" Grace hesitated. "Not really, but I'll manage." He didn't press, just reached into the glove box, pulled out a business card, and wrote something on the back before handing it to her. "My cell. Call if you need anything." She took it with both hands, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it. Their eyes met just for a moment. The rain, the stillness, the strange sense that something important had passed between them. He nodded once. "Rest well, Grace." And then he was gone. Back in her apartment. Grace leaned against the door, heart still racing. The air smelled faintly of old wood and lavender detergent. She set the book on the counter, along with the card. Her hands trembled. It wasn't the fall that shook her. It was the way he'd looked at her, like she mattered. Sometimes the loudest place is your own mind, especially when someone kind just stepped in. The quiet in Grace's apartment used to comfort her. Now, it pulsed with questions she couldn't hush. She lay stretched out on the small floral couch, her wrapped ankle resting on a pillow that had seen better days. Outside the window, the rain had softened into a mist, casting the street below in a dreamy haze. The old radiator hissed beside her. A kettle boiled faintly in the kitchen, its whistle a gentle reminder that the world still moved. But inside her chest, a storm. It wasn't just the pain in her foot, though that was enough to make movement a calculated effort. It was something else, something less visible, more persistent. Like a room in her mind had been opened suddenly, after years of being locked. And in that room stood Garrett Langston, his coat damp with rain, his eyes unreadable but never cruel, his voice low, even unmistakably concerned. It wasn't the moment he picked her up that replayed most in her mind. It was what he didn't say, the way he made space for her silence, the way he asked nothing but still seemed to understand everything. That night, Grace barely slept. She tried to read, but her eyes kept drifting. She tried to journal, but every sentence spiraled into questions she didn't want to answer. Mostly, she just sat there, her apartment unusually loud with creaking floors, ticking clocks, and the thump of her own heartbeat in her ears. By morning, a small box had arrived on her doorstep. She found it just before noon, nestled quietly between the door frame and the welcome mat. No note on the outside, just her name, neatly printed, inside a tin of Earl Grey tea, a bar of dark chocolate wrapped in gold foil, and a paperback novel, Olive Kitteridge. The pages were gently worn, as though someone had read it recently. Pressed between the chapters was a pale blue envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, a single sentence in neat, elegant handwriting. "I hope your story ends well." No signature. But she knew. She knew the moment her breath caught in her throat. She'd read the novel years ago, back when she still shared a mailbox and a marriage bed, back when she believed her story had already taken its shape, already narrowed into the life she thought she deserved. Garrett Langston had no way of knowing what that book meant to her. Or maybe he did. Grace set the envelope down gently, fingers lingering on the edge. Her apartment, so often filled with silence, now throbbed with something unfamiliar. Hope. It felt small, almost out of place. She poured herself a cup of tea, letting the steam rise in slow, swirling ribbons. The scent of bergamot filled the kitchen, warm and grounding. As she stood there, cradling the mug in both hands, she caught her reflection in the window hair loose, sweater oversized, face pale but thoughtful, not beautiful, not tragic, just present. She hadn't felt that in a long time. Her ankle still ached, reminding her of the fall, of her fragility, but something steadier pulsed beneath the bruises. That evening, she found herself reaching for her journal, not to vent, but to write, not about work, not about tasks, but about what lingered between silence and speech. She wrote about his hands, the way he looked at her, not through her. She wrote about the book, the gift, the sentence that somehow filled more space than entire conversations. She wrote for herself, and for the first time in years, she didn't cross a single word out. By the second day, she could limp without the crutches inside her apartment. A small victory. She toasted a slice of sourdough, spread it with honey, and sat at the breakfast table with the book open beside her, its pages already bending to her touch. But, with each passing hour, she found herself glancing toward the door, listening, wondering. And when the clock struck 4 p.m. on the third day, the knock came, not loud, not urgent, just deliberate. Grace froze mid-step, her hand still on the arm of the chair. Her heart skipped, then thudded back with a curious rhythm. She opened the door slowly. Garrett stood there, holding 2 coffees in a cardboard tray. His coat was buttoned neatly, his shoes dark with drizzle. He offered a small smile, not too familiar, not too formal. "I figured you could use something stronger than tea," he said simply. Grace blinked, almost forgetting to answer. The world narrowed to the tray in his hands, the steam rising gently between them, and the soft sound of his breath in the cool afternoon air. She stepped aside, still barefoot. "Come in," she said, the words soft but clear. 2 cups of coffee, 1 broken past, and the possibility of something more. The aroma reached her before he did. Dark roast, no sugar, familiar, comforting. Grace led Garrett into her apartment with a subtle nod, careful not to limp too noticeably. She didn't want to draw attention to her still healing ankle, but she noticed how his eyes flicked down anyway, tracking her movement like he might step in if she faltered. He didn't say anything, and she was grateful for that. He set the tray down on her kitchen table, a small oak piece with scuffed corners and a bowl of oranges she rarely ate. The space was tidy but lived in, marked by soft lighting and book piles in odd corners. A crocheted blanket lay draped over the arm of the couch, half finished. Garrett took it all in without comment, his gaze settling briefly on the shelf above her writing desk, where framed photos stood quietly like whispers from another life. "Sugar's in the cupboard," she offered, moving toward the counter out of habit. "I'm fine," he said, sliding a cup toward her. "Black is good." They sat down across from each other, steam curling between them like a silent third guest. For a few minutes, they drank without speaking. Grace wrapped her hands around the warmth of the cup, anchoring herself. It had been a long time since someone sat across from her like this, without urgency, without noise, just presence. Garrett broke the silence first. "You always read in the break room." She looked up, surprised. "I didn't think anyone noticed." "I did." A simple answer, but the weight of it startled her. "I like stories that take their time," she said softly. "The quiet ones, where people aren't perfect, but they try." He nodded slowly. "That's rare." She smiled faintly, and unpopular. He didn't argue, just took another sip of coffee. "My brother used to read to me," he said after a moment. "He was older, smarter. He could make anything sound like poetry, even the back of a cereal box." Grace tilted her head. "Was he a writer?" "No," Garrett said, eyes distant. "He wanted to be. But life didn't cooperate." She waited, sensing the edge of something delicate. "He passed away 8 years ago," he said, almost too casually. "Heart condition, sudden. He was 37. Grace set her cup down. "I'm sorry." He offered a nod, but the air between them changed, softened. "We were close," he continued. "I always admired how he could feel so much. I couldn't, still can't, most days." Grace searched his expression for a hint of irony or distance, but what she saw was something else entirely. Not coldness, not reserve, restraint. "He would have liked you," Garrett said after a pause. "You notice things, small things." Grace felt her throat tighten. "I think I got tired of being small." He looked at her, gently. She hesitated, then let the words come. "My ex-husband once told me that I blended into walls, that I was easy to leave." Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop, and part of me believed him, that I was just ordinary, too quiet to matter. Garrett leaned back slightly, but his eyes never left hers. He was wrong. 2 words, firm, unblinking. Grace blinked away, the heat building behind her eyes. She hadn't meant to say that out loud. It had slipped out the way thoughts sometimes did when someone is actually listening. She tucked her hair behind her ear, trying to steady herself. "Anyway, that's why I like stories. They let you be seen, even when you're invisible everywhere else." Garrett studied her for a long moment, then reached over not to touch, but to gesture toward the journal lying half hidden beside the fruit bowl. "Is that yours?" She nodded slowly. "Do you write in it?" "Sometimes." "What about stories?" She hesitated. "I used to, not seriously, just bits and pieces." He smiled, not with his mouth, but with something softer in his gaze. "Have you ever thought of writing your own story?" The question landed with more weight than he probably intended. Grace stared at him, heart thudding. Because yes, she had thought of it. She'd tried, once, on rainy weekends and sleepless nights. She had notebooks filled with half-finished pages and characters that looked suspiciously like her, but braver. She had wanted to tell stories of quiet women who weren't chosen, but chose themselves. But she had never believed any of it was worth finishing. Until now. Something shifted inside her, like a curtain pulled back to let in light she hadn't realized she'd missed. "I don't know if I could," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. Garrett didn't push. "You don't have to know," he said, standing up. "You just have to begin." He picked up his coat, paused at the door. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he added, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Grace nodded, still holding the warmth of his words in her chest. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt quiet again, but not empty, not anymore. The closer you are to the light, the longer the shadows become. The first thing Grace noticed when she stepped back into the office wasn't the hum of printers or the scent of reheated coffee. It was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that cradled thought and quiet productivity. This was a brittle silence, thin and stretched, ready to snap. She had only been gone for a little over a week. Her ankle, now mostly healed, still bore the tenderness of the fall, and she walked a bit slower than usual. But physically, she was fine. Emotionally, something had shifted, and she felt it the moment she walked through the door. It started with small things, eyes that flicked away too quickly, conversations that paused mid-sentence, a sudden, practiced smile from Allison Tate, the kind of smile that looked like it had been ironed into place. Allison was the senior administrative manager, older than Grace by about 10 years, and had worked at Langston & Co. long before Grace had even moved to Charleston. She had always been cordial, efficient, proper, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, organized potlucks, and handed out backhanded compliments like party favors. But today, her cheerfulness had a brittle edge. "Well, look who's back," Allison said as Grace passed her desk. "Hope your recovery was restful." Grace gave a polite nod. "It was. Thank you." She didn't linger. Back at her own workstation, Grace tried to settle in. Emails had piled up, but not as badly as she feared. A few welcome back notes sat at the top of her inbox, generic, professional. But by mid-morning, the air had changed. At the copy machine, two women she barely knew exchanged glances when Grace approached. In the break room, someone lowered their voice the moment she walked in. She smiled, tried to participate, but her words fell flat, like stones into shallow water. During lunch, she sat alone by the window, stirring a cup of yogurt she no longer felt like eating. Her mind raced, but her body remained still. And then she heard it. "I mean, if I got injured and Garrett Langston himself took me home." A voice floated from behind the partition. Laughter followed. "Right. Maybe I need to fall down a flight of stairs." More laughter. Grace's cheeks burned. She didn't turn around. She didn't breathe. She just sat. The whispering didn't stop. By the second day, rumors had bloomed like weeds. People were saying she had caught the boss's eye, that she was working her way up and not through her spreadsheets, that perhaps, as one woman put it, being quiet and pretty has its perks. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because she had worked so hard for so long to be known for her reliability, her diligence, her lack of scandal, and now, with one twist of an ankle and a gesture of unexpected kindness, all of that was being erased, rewritten into a story she didn't recognize. And the worst part, somewhere deep inside, the old version of herself, the one shaped by years of not being chosen, believed them. That afternoon, she passed by the open office lounge and stopped cold. There, on the couch, sat three co-workers, one of them Allison. They were laughing, sipping coffee, flipping through a printout of company event photos. Grace didn't think they'd seen her, until one of them leaned in and said, not quietly, "She's not even his type, but maybe that's the charm." Another voice chimed in, "Plain girls always know how to keep secrets." Grace turned and walked away before they could see her face. Her hands shook as she typed her next email. By the end of the day, she requested a meeting with HR. The office was bright, too bright. The coordinator, a younger woman with a nervous smile, listened carefully as Grace spoke. "I'd like to request a transfer," Grace said, voice calm. The coordinator blinked. "A transfer. Yes. I believe there's an opening on the inventory team. That would be quite a change," the woman said gently. "It's a different pace, less visible." "That's the point," Grace replied. The coordinator didn't press further. The request was processed in less than an hour. When Grace returned to her desk to collect her things, Evan, the CEO's assistant, walked past. He paused, looked like he wanted to say something, but then his gaze dropped to the papers in her hand, and he stepped aside. No one said goodbye. No one asked why. Grace left the floor the same way she'd entered it her first day, quiet, unnoticed. But this time, the silence felt like defeat. She returned home to her apartment just before sunset, dropped her bag by the door, and collapsed onto the couch. Her ankle throbbed faintly, but her heart ached more. She had begun to believe that maybe being seen didn't have to be painful, but perhaps the world didn't agree. As she rested her head against the back of the couch, her phone lit up beside her. Garrett Langston. The screen glowed quietly, vibrating once, twice, then again. Grace stared at the name, unmoving. She knew he would ask what happened. He would ask why. He might even try to fix it. But how could she explain something that had no clean shape? No clear villain. How could she explain that sometimes? It wasn't one person who hurt you. It was the weight of being misunderstood. So, she let the phone ring. And ring, and ring. Until silence returned. Sometimes, silence is louder than shouting, especially when the heart is involved. It had been 4 days since Grace ignored his call, and in those 4 days, the quiet between them had expanded like a slow-moving fog, thick, unrelenting, a silence not made of peace, but of distance. Garrett had called once more the following evening. She'd let it ring again, not because she wanted to hurt him. She wasn't sure she could, but because she didn't trust what her voice would sound like if she picked up, because there was something fragile in her chest, something that had only just begun to take shape, and she feared the sound of his voice might shatter it. At Langston & Co., Garrett noticed her absence the moment he stepped off the elevator. The inventory department sat tucked away at the back of the building, quiet, functional, hidden, a place for numbers and boxes, not people and dreams. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, just walked the narrow hallway until he reached the glass partition that separated the supply room from the office floor. Through it, he saw her. Grace was seated at a small table, reviewing packing slips with a red pen. She looked focused, still. A cup of tea sat beside her, half finished. She hadn't noticed him yet, and something about the way she moved the calm precision of her hands, the slight crease between her brows made him pause. She didn't look like someone who had been driven away. She looked like someone who had chosen to disappear. He didn't step inside. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small envelope, cream-colored, his handwriting on the front, Grace. He gave it to Evan without a word. "Leave this on her desk. Don't mention it came from me." Then he walked away. Grace found the envelope an hour later, wedged between 2 manila folders. Her breath caught as she turned it over in her hands. It was light, just one sheet inside. She hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate just like him. "Grace, I don't write often. I tend to speak less and act more, but you're not someone I want to act around without saying what I mean. Your absence is louder than the noise of the world, and I find myself listening for you when I shouldn't be listening for anyone. I understand if silence is your answer, but I needed you to know that I see it, I hear it, and I feel it. Garrett." She read it 3 times, then folded it and placed it inside her journal without a word, because part of her ached, and part of her didn't know how to believe him. People like Garrett Langston didn't miss women like her. They didn't write letters. They didn't turn down gala dinners or investor meetings for someone they'd known only a handful of weeks. And yet, that very evening, as she passed by the main conference room on her way to the copy machine, she overheard a conversation, unguarded, unfiltered. 2 senior managers were chatting near the door, unaware of her presence. "I can't believe he skipped the Hilton dinner," one said. "The whole Seattle group flew in. He just said he wasn't in the headspace. Yeah, canceled everything. First time in 5 years." Grace stood still, her fingers tightening around the file in her arms. Was that because of her? Because she hadn't answered? Because she'd stepped back into her shell and left him standing outside it, she shook the thought away. It didn't matter. They were too different, too far apart. And yet the words from his letter clung to her like fog on morning glass. Your absence is louder than the noise of the world. Back at her desk, she stared at her screen, but saw none of it. Her eyes kept drifting to the corner where her journal sat, closed, heavy. The next morning, news buzzed through the office like static. A major investor meeting, scheduled for that afternoon, had hit a snag. The presenter, Dale Mitchell, the firm's most polished speaker, was stuck at O'Hare Airport due to weather delays. No connecting flights until evening. The pitch materials were done. The investors were en route. Garrett had cleared his calendar, but there was no one to lead the meeting. Grace heard the whispers from her post in inventory. Allison can't step in. She doesn't know the details. Garrett hates last-minute changes. They might cancel the whole thing. At noon, Grace stood by the office coffee machine, her thoughts a tangle of nerves and hesitation. She sipped slowly, trying to push the storm inside her into order. And then, as she turned to return to her desk, she saw him, Garrett. Standing by the far window, phone in one hand, the other resting in his pocket. His suit was crisp, as always, but his posture carried something different today, restraint or fatigue. Their eyes met, just for a second. And in that second, the silence between them roared louder than words. She wasn't on the agenda, but she was the only one who could save the day. The air in the office was taut with urgency. It wasn't panic, exactly, but it was the kind of tension that turned footsteps sharp and conversations clipped. Phones rang faster, laptops opened wider, coffee sat forgotten, cooling in mugs. The investor presentation, the one circled in red on everyone's calendar, was about to collapse under the weight of a missing presenter. Grace sat at her small desk in the inventory corner, the hum of a nearby label printer buzzing behind her. She tried to focus on the numbers on the screen, but the words of Garrett's letter still lingered in her chest like an echo. Her absence is louder than the noise of the world. She wasn't supposed to be involved in the meeting, wasn't invited, wasn't needed. But weeks ago, long before her fall, before the whispers and the distance, she had helped prepare the data model for the investor report, quietly, thoroughly, without credit. It had been one of the last things she'd done before stepping into that ill-fated swivel chair. And now, the version being used had a gap, a serious one. She'd spotted it the moment she saw the printout someone had left on the break room table. A miscalculation in the projected overhead for next quarter. A line shifted 2 rows down in the spreadsheet, almost invisible. But the consequences, massive. If presented as is, the error could damage trust, if not cost the company the contract altogether. She stared at the numbers, heart thudding in her ears. She could say nothing, stay in her corner, let the meeting fail. Or she could step forward. No invitation, no permission, just conviction. Grace stood. She took a deep breath, grabbed the binder where she'd kept her annotated version of the report, and limped slowly toward the executive floor. Her ankle still needed support, so she leaned gently on the crutch she'd tucked behind her desk. Each step echoed louder than the last, not because of the sound, but because of the decision. The boardroom was already half full when she arrived. Garrett stood at the far end of the table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, looking down at his notes. Around him, men in tailored suits checked their watches. A tall woman with sharp eyes tapped a pen against her tablet, clearly restless. Grace stepped to the doorway. A young assistant moved to stop her, but Garrett looked up at that exact moment and froze. For a second, the room seemed to pause around him. Grace met his eyes and nodded. "I believe there's an error in the overhead projection," she said clearly, holding up her binder. The silence was immediate. One investor turned in his chair. Garrett blinked, stunned, but then something changed in his expression. Not shock, not suspicion, recognition. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said quietly. "Show us." Grace hobbled forward slowly, but with purpose. She opened the binder on the table, flipped to the section marked in blue ink, and turned it to face the group. The formula here pulls from row 58 instead of row 56. She said, pointing, it underreports fixed costs by nearly 3%. That impacts net projections for Q3 and, more importantly, throws off your break-even analysis. A pause, then murmurs. One investor leaned in, brows raised. Another checked the printed report in his hands. She's right, someone said. The woman with the tablet looked at Garrett. Was this caught before Garrett's gaze never left Grace? It was now. They spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the correction. Grace explained the adjustment with quiet authority, answering every question with calm clarity. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't rehearsed, but she was prepared. And by the time the meeting wrapped, the investors looked satisfied, impressed. Even, as they filed out, several nodded at her. A few offered polite smiles. Garrett remained by the window, arms crossed, watching. When the last guest left, the room emptied quickly, papers gathered, chairs scraped back. Grace stood near the far corner, her hand resting on the edge of the table, trying to catch her breath. Her ankle ached, but her heart was soaring. She had stepped into the light, and she hadn't broken. A moment later, she felt someone enter the room again. She turned. It was him. Garrett stood by the doorway, holding the door open like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to come closer. But there was something in his expression that she hadn't seen in a long time in anyone. Pride. You saved the contract, he said softly. I fixed a number, she replied. No, he said, you did more than that. He walked in slowly, letting the door close behind him. The room fell quiet again, but this time, the silence felt full, not empty. Grace turned toward the window. The skyline outside shimmered in late afternoon gold, casting long shadows across the polished table. I almost didn't come, she admitted, her voice low. He stepped beside her. Not too close. Just near enough? I'm glad you did. Grace looked at her reflection in the glass. The woman staring back was not invisible, not small, not forgettable. She was here. I didn't do it for the company, she said after a moment. I know, he replied, and something in the way he said it, simple, certain, made her eyes sting. He wasn't thanking her for saving the deal. He was thanking her for showing up. If this was just a phase, why does it hurt like it's real? The office lights had dimmed, not off, just softer, like the building itself understood the need for quiet. Garrett and Grace stood side by side near the long window, the city below slowly slipping into the hush of evening. Distant headlights blinked. A church bell rang somewhere, muted by glass and time. Neither spoke for a long moment. Grace could feel the silence press against her chest. It wasn't heavy, but it wasn't easy either. So much had been left unsaid for so long. Finally, she turned to him. What are we doing? She asked, voice gentle but sure. I mean, this... Garrett didn't look away. I've been asking myself the same thing. She nodded slowly, and he took a breath, deep and careful. And I keep coming back to one thing. If this was just a moment, just kindness after a fall, then why does it still live with me days later? Grace's throat tightened. It's not just you, she said. She stepped back, leaning slightly against the window frame. I've spent most of my life trying not to be noticed, and now, suddenly, I'm afraid of being seen too much. Garrett's expression softened. I know that fear. She raised an eyebrow. Do you... He gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Everyone sees the role, the title, the decisions, but not the man. Grace looked down at her hands, fingers twisting slightly in the hem of her sleeve. What if we're just filling a gap in each other's lives? What if this isn't real? He stepped closer. If it wasn't real, he said quietly, you wouldn't have changed the way I walk into my own office? She blinked. What do you mean? You used to barely look up when I passed, he said. Now, when you're not there, it's all I notice. A silence bloomed between them this time, a silence of vulnerability, not avoidance. Grace felt something stir in her chest, a mix of fear and warmth and that old instinct to pull away before anything could hurt. But she didn't step back. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of you, of me, of hoping again." "I'm scared too," he said, his voice lower now. "I've built a life that works on control. This us doesn't fit in any structure I know." She looked up. "Then why keep reaching? Because not reaching feels worse." Her breath hitched. He looked at her like someone studying something fragile, but not because it might break, because it mattered. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you," he said, handing it to her. "But after the meeting, I went back to your desk." She looked at the paper in her hands, recognized it immediately. The beginning of her unfinished novel, the one she thought no one had ever read, the one she'd tucked away out of habit more than hope. "I found this," he said. "I read it, all of it." Her fingers tightened. "You weren't supposed to." "I know," he said softly, "but I did." A pause. "I stayed up until 3 a.m, he added, "because I couldn't stop turning the pages." Grace stared at him, disbelief shadowing her face. "I don't know what to say." "Let me," he said gently. "It's beautiful, honest, unapologetically quiet, like you." She felt the heat rising in her throat. "It's unfinished." "So, finish it," he replied. "Or let someone help you do it. I've already spoken to a small press I know. They're interested." She blinked. "What I sent them a chapter, with your initials only. They called me 2 hours later." Grace stood still, frozen between joy and fear. She'd always dreamed someone would say her voice mattered, but she never believed it would actually happen. Not like this. Not from him. She looked at him. The man she had once feared from afar. The man who had now, impossibly, become the one person who saw her not for who she tried to be, but for who she quietly was. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He stepped forward. "Because it's the only thing I've done lately that feels like the truth." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They stood there in the soft light of the office, the sounds of the world outside barely reaching them, as if time itself had agreed to pause. A few moments later, Garrett took her coat from the back of the chair, held it open for her. "Let me drive you home," he said. Grace hesitated, but not out of doubt. She nodded, letting him help her into the coat. As they stepped into the hallway, side by side, something unspoken traveled between them, not boss and assistant, not rescuer and rescued, just two people, wounded, honest, awake, and maybe at the start of something worth holding on to. Sometimes we don't write the story writes us. Spring folded into summer with a softness Grace hadn't known she needed. It had been 3 months since the day she stood at the head of that boardroom, binder in hand, ankle still tender, heart trembling. 3 months since Garrett Langston, cold, unreadable, untouchable, had looked at her, not as a subordinate, not as a shadow in the hall, but as a person worth listening to. And not just listening to, believing in. She hadn't returned to the inventory department. Instead, a quiet internal promotion was announced, Operations Strategy Coordinator, a title she hadn't asked for, but one that now sat humbly under her nameplate near the glass offices. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was hers. She still came in early, still left late, still packed her own lunch and preferred tea over catered coffee. But something inside her had changed. She smiled more. She looked up when she walked. And most nights after the city lights blinked on and the world quieted, she wrote. Every evening, she sat by the window of her apartment, the one that overlooked the sleepy Charleston rooftops, and let the words come, not perfect words, not fast ones, but honest ones. The story she once abandoned now lived again. Characters she thought she'd buried whispered through her pen. Dialogues returned, pages multiplied. And when she sent the full manuscript nervously, silently to the small press Garrett had connected her with. She did so with the strange comfort that this time she wouldn't shatter if it didn't work out. But it did work out. 2 weeks later, an email arrived. "We love it. Let's talk next steps." She cried alone that night, not out of disbelief, but relief. It wasn't fame she wanted, not shelves at big bookstores, not interviews or book tours. She wanted to be heard, to be remembered, to tell stories that mattered in the quiet corners of someone else's life. Garrett never made a show of it. He never once brought it up at work, never called attention to her accomplishment. But he was there in the quiet ways that counted. An annotated draft on her desk with a sticky note, page 42, beautiful. A new pen tucked inside her top drawer. A book of essays by her favorite author mailed anonymously to her apartment. And sometimes, just the warmth of his presence as they walked to the parking lot together, saying little, but meaning much. Their connection had no label, no grand gestures, no declarations, but it was real, and it grew slowly, like wild ivy sturdy, quiet, lasting. One afternoon, while printing a revised report near the executive lounge, Grace overheard a heated conversation, hushed, but unmistakable. Allison, the woman who had once smiled with poison behind her teeth, now, cornered in a tense exchange with HR. Phrases floated out, falsified reimbursements, unauthorized vendor account, pending audit. Grace didn't linger. She returned to her desk, placed the final file in the tray, and moved on. Later, someone asked if she was surprised. She only smiled, not with smugness, but with peace, because she didn't need revenge. She didn't need to be right. She had already won by simply walking forward. Weeks passed. The book proofs arrived small, beautiful things with soft covers and her name printed in gentle serif across the top. G. Whitmore. She almost didn't attend the launch event. It was small, held in a corner bookstore tucked between a florist and a tea shop. Nothing grand, just a dozen chairs, a tray of cookies, and a table where she sat with folded hands and a pen that clicked nervously beneath her thumb. People trickled in, a librarian, a nurse, a woman who ran a quilting group, a teenage girl with round glasses and shy eyes. They all came not because she was famous, but because they loved stories. Stories like hers. She greeted each reader with grace and gratitude, signing with a shaking hand, heart full. And then, as the evening light poured golden through the window panes, she saw him, standing at the back of the room, near the last row of chairs. Garrett, no suit, no tie, just a dark button-down, sleeves rolled, arms crossed, loosely watching her, proud, still, silent. He didn't approach. He didn't need to, because she saw him, and he saw her, not as secretary, not as strategy coordinator, not even as author, but as the woman who once fell and chose to rise, the woman who turned pain into page, silence into sentence. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, soaking in the warmth of the moment. This wasn't the life she dreamed of at 22, wide-eyed and married too young. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real, and it was hers. The unthinkable wasn't that he loved her, it was that he finally said it out loud. The company's 15th anniversary celebration was held in the grand ballroom of the Charleston Pavilion, an elegant space dressed in soft lights and polished silver, where the city's warm night air drifted gently through open terrace doors. Grace arrived quietly. She wore a simple navy dress, soft at the shoulders, fitted at the waist, nothing extravagant. But she looked at herself in the mirror before leaving her apartment and just this once allowed herself to feel beautiful. People greeted her differently now, with respect, with familiarity, some even with admiration. Allison wasn't there. Her departure had been swift and discreet after the internal audit confirmed misused company funds. HR never made a show of it, and neither did Grace. Justice, when it came quietly, didn't need applause. The ballroom buzzed with conversation and champagne. Employees from every floor mingled, a string quartet playing in the background. Laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses. Grace took a seat at a small table near the back, close enough to see but far enough to stay out of the spotlight, until the spotlight moved to her. Midway through the evening, Garrett Langston took the stage, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, no tie, collar slightly open. He looked relaxed, but there was an unusual stillness to him tonight, like something bracing to be said. The room quieted quickly. Garrett rarely spoke at company events, and when he did, he was brief, efficient, always professional. Tonight was different. He paused, eyes sweeping across the crowd, then down to the page in his hand. "I don't usually do speeches," he began, voice low but steady. "You all know that." A few chuckles. "But tonight, I need to say something that can't be written in an email or tucked into a year-end memo." Grace shifted slightly in her seat. Garrett looked out again, then down. 15 years ago, I started this company with blueprints and debt, with vision and very little sleep. I built systems, designed structures, told myself that if I just worked hard enough, I could control every outcome. He paused, and then someone fell in my hallway. Soft laughter rippled through the room. Grace's heart skipped. Garrett smiled gently. "You all know who I'm talking about. You've known her longer than I have, and yet, somehow, I didn't really see her until that moment." He looked up, eyes searching. Then they found her. "Grace Whitmore," he said, "didn't just help save a contract, or improve operations, or publish a beautiful book, which she did. She reminded me to look again, at people, at life." Gasps, whispers. All eyes turned to her. Grace sat frozen, breath shallow, unsure whether to stand or disappear. Garrett continued, holding up a small, worn copy of her novel. "There's a passage in here that I've carried with me since I first read it. I'd like to share it." He opened the book, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "She was the kind of woman who blended in not because she lacked color, but because the world never looked close enough to see her. But once you noticed the way she listened, the way she felt things deeply without needing to explain, you couldn't unsee her. You wouldn't want to." A hush fell over the ballroom. Garrett closed the book slowly. "I saw her, and I couldn't unsee her." He stepped down from the stage and walked straight to Grace. Every step was deliberate, measured, not rushed, not dramatic, just real. When he reached her, he didn't hesitate. He held out his hand. She took it, fingers trembling. He leaned in, not to kiss, not to perform, but to say something meant only for her. "It's not just your story anymore. It's ours." Her eyes welled, not from shock, but from the quiet, overwhelming truth of it. The applause came slowly, then all at once, not for drama, not for gossip, but for the rightness of it. Later, when the music resumed and people danced and the party found its rhythm again, Grace stepped out onto the terrace for a moment of stillness. Garrett joined her a few minutes later, standing beside her in the dark, looking out over Charleston's twinkling skyline. No words were needed. The city breathed, the stars blinked, and between them, a silence that didn't ache but healed, because this was not the beginning, nor was it the end. It was just one chapter, one they had decided to write together. Grace turned to him, smile soft. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. He reached for her hand. "Neither am I." And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the world, another woman heard her story and believed that maybe, just maybe, she could be seen too. Sometimes, the most powerful change begins not with grand gestures, but with being quietly seen. Grace's story reminds us that even when the world overlooks us, our worth doesn't disappear. We may not always be the loudest voice in the room, or the person others expect to rise, but dignity, kindness, and quiet resilience have a power of their own. It takes courage to keep showing up when no one seems to notice. It takes even more to believe in yourself after years of being invisible. But in the still moments over a book, a cup of tea, or a conversation with someone who truly listens, we find something stronger than recognition. We find connection and healing. This story is not just about love. It's about reclaiming your voice. It's about choosing yourself even after others have overlooked you. Because it's never too late to be seen, to be valued not for who you're trying to become, but for who you quietly are. So, if you've ever felt forgotten, take heart. Sometimes, the story that saves you is the one you start writing for yourself. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to life, stories that heal, inspire, and remind us we're never truly alone. We're so glad you're here, and we hope you'll stay for the next chapter.